This is Take 5 with Bentley, Nevada. Again with us today in the studio is Chris McMillan, Senior Product Manager for Bentley, Nevada's sensor portfolio, and that includes the Ranger Pro wireless system. Hey, Chris, welcome back.
An honor and a pleasure to be back.
Chris, last time we talked about the differences between dynamic data and static data, or sometimes called waveform versus overall data. You underscored for us that both types of data are really important, and hence the Ranger Pro system delivers both kinds of data. But I think a question that people have is the bandwidth consumed by dynamic data can be pretty substantial, and there can be some trade-offs with the amount of data that you send and how often you send it and how much battery life you're consuming in that wireless sensor. And I wondered if you could just take a minute or two and talk about some of the things Bentley's done with regards to battery life and the configurability of the types of data that come back and how often and so forth.
Certainly. Well, I'm going to kick off real quick just with any wireless sensor. If it's battery powered and sourced, obviously it's going to consume, and battery life becomes at least either of a concern or just something the end user needs to be aware of. When it comes to dynamic or those velocity, waveforms and spectrum data, that requires the sensor itself, the wireless sensor, to basically wake up. It's got to take that sensor reading, and it takes a lot more measurement points than, say, an overall process value. So it certainly does, consume battery life, more so, or at least it's more intensive on capacity here. And that third factor here, when it talks about battery life, you mentioned it is frequency, and I'm not talking about vibration frequency here. I'm talking about frequency of how often is data taken. How often does that sensor whether it's configured. In the case of Ranger Pro, it's highly configurable to take data, and you can optimize battery life. You can take data in as short or as fast a time as possible, as around it once every 10 minutes, or you can set it up to conserve battery life here, and take data once an hour or once every 6 hours. All depends on the user. Another quick thing that we've done, at least as far as optimizing battery life, is we've got some things like to call them advanced features around data on severity. You can add some embedded smarts, not to go into too much detail because we're short on time, but you can add some smarts into the sensor. Some offerings here where the sensor will basically auto detect and change how often it takes data based upon the level of data coming through. If that's we've got a machine that looks like it's trending up or becoming into an alert and alarm status. An operator, you're going to want to see that data. You're going to want to see a lot more data. So Ranger Pro will default itself to taking data quicker and quicker. And then certainly as that issue subsides and levels start to fall into more normal means, it can default back to a slower data rate.
So the sensor, what I heard you say, Chris, the sensor's smart enough to know when it needs to talk more frequently and when it can kind of back off because things aren't as interesting. Can you, because the two types of data might consume different bandwidth and different drain on the battery, can you configure those two things separately? Is the dynamic data rate different than the static data rate?
No, they are configured separately because of that battery concern. You can configure, either to be slower or faster, but they are separate configurations, or you can have them lockstep, with the exception of, that waveform data. We want to specifically ensure that there's a long useful life for batteries out there. So on a spectrum or waveform measurements, we limit that down to fastest maximum collection rate of once every 6 hours.
Okay. Well, hopefully a failure mode on a machine would not be less than 6 hours. I mean, that seems like the point of a wireless system is you could get frequent data, but you don't really need continuous data.
Yeah, we want to be proactive with the data coming in from wireless, give you customers enough of an edge to foresee and prevent, what I think you're referring to as what we call a unfortunate reactive failure, where things happen rapidly.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I think that's helpful. It's helped the listener understand the trade-offs with battery life, the configurability of the system. Bentley's really thought this thing through, so my hat's off to you and what you've done with this product. We are only about 20% into everywhere I'd like to go and all the questions I've got. So let's do this. Let's have you back for some more episodes. We'll wrap things up for today. I'll say thanks for being in the studio and invite you back for next time. For those of you who have tuned in for the first time, this is Take 5 with Bentley, Nevada, a Baker Hughes